Hello and a warm welcome to Federal's special program, Capital Beat. The de facto blockade of the Strait of Hormuz by Iran in response to the United States Israel war has caused one of the worst energy crises in decades, with experts warning of a global recession. Now, the maritime route through which about 20% of the global oil and gas supplies pass has been thrust into the spotlight as Tehran has used it as a geopolitical bargaining chip in the war. Now, nearly 2,000 vessels are stranded close to the narrow strait, which is located between Iran on its northern side and Oman and United Arab Emirates on its southern side. Now, Iranian media has reported that the country's parliament is seeking to pass a legislation to collect the tolls for ships transiting the world's single most important oil passageway. Now, the reports by the Tasnim and Fars news agencies have quoted the chairman of Parliament's Civil Affairs Committee and said that a draft law has been prepared and will soon be finalized by the Islamic Consultative Assembly's legal team. Now, according to this plan, Iran must collect fees to ensure the security of ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. This is what the officials have quoted to the Tasnim and the Fars news agencies. And they've said that this is completely natural. Just as in other corridors, when goods pass through a country, duties are paid. Strait of Hormuz is also a corridor. We ensure its security, and it is natural for ships and tankers to pay as us duties. But even without that domestic legal framework, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is IRGC, has already imposed a toll booth system to control vessel traffic through the strait. This is what has been reported widely. So, why is Iran building a toll booth system? Now, Iran, whose territorial waters extend into the strait, has blocked the passage of vessels carrying oil and liquefied natural gas from the Gulf to the rest of the world since the US and Israel launched the war on February 28. Now, since Iran is talking about a legislation to convert the Strait of Hormuz into toll booth, is it that easy as it sounds? What are the challenges? What about the sovereignty of the territorial waters? Can the Strait of Hormuz become like Suez Canal? All these questions are staring at everyone. So we'll try and discuss this today. Now, so Iran is tightening the control over the Strait of Hormuz. Look, so these are the few pointers which will give you a slight idea. I'm just going to read them over. Iran tightens the grip over the Strait of Hormuz. Ships reportedly vetted by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This is what exactly is happening right now. Traffic down nearly 90% since the Iran war. Oil prices have surged. Asia is facing the supply stress. Exports steady via Kharg Island to China. And Iran-linked vessels now dominate the transits. So the questions we were asking, that is it that easy for Iran to convert Strait of Hormuz into a permanent toll booth system? Can they replicate the idea of a Suez Canal as far as the Strait of Hormuz is concerned? What are the challenges? Joining me this evening is Professor Aftab Kamal Pasha, international affairs expert and diplomat. So thank you so much for joining. We have Kallol Bhattacharya, who's the senior assistant foreign affairs editor of The Hindu. Thank you so much. And let me begin with Kallol today. Kallol has been reporting a lot on these issues. Kallol, what are you hearing? Is it true that Iran is thinking of bringing in a legislation as far as converting the Strait of Hormuz into a toll booth system? To unmute. Kallol, just unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Niluji. And yes, it's nice to be back in your show once again. What we have been hearing is that Iran intends to convert the Strait of Hormuz, which is a naturally formed strait that connects the Persian Gulf or the Gulf with the Arabian Sea into kind of a kind of commercially viable strait project for its state. The main problem, however, here is that when we look at the history of the straits in the world, especially the ones that were built or rather constructed in the late 19th and the early 20th century, we find that most of the straits that were built at the end of the 19th century, like the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal, were essentially engineering marvels, and these were not naturally formed straits or canals. These were built and constructed by thousands of people under the guidance of British and French engineers. But the Strait of Hormuz is, as we all can see, a naturally formed strait, and therefore, how far Iran will be successful in policing this strait and also turn it into a commercial venture and etc. is something that only time will tell us. But however, one thing that Iran can do is that, which it is already doing, is that it is increasing the risk associated with the strait, and as a result, it may become commercially more challenging for shipping companies and maritime companies to invest in projects or to invest in ideas that are associated with this strait. Now, if you look at the history of the last century, we find that there have been very often conflicts when it came to these straits. We saw the 1956 conflict over the Suez Canal when it was nationalized by the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now, if you look at the Strait of Hormuz, it actually began without it being activated. The idea was that the Americans and the Israelis would start pounding Iran and trigger a regime change. But instead, Iran has been able to turn the war and the entire military focus of the war into the Strait of Hormuz, where it is in an advantageous position. Now, having said that, what is also to Iran's advantage is that Iran has number of islands that are strung across the Strait of Hormuz. And if Iran decides to carry on or build some sort of infrastructure project connecting these multiple islands, then it can again, increase the risk factors associated with this strait. And commercial shipping is a very is in terms of investment a very precarious industry, because companies invest in commercial shipping only when they are 100% certain of getting profit. And if there are such risks associated with investing in a maritime firm that would be involved in cruising through the Strait of Hormuz every month, then that firm and that company will become less attractive for insurers as well as investors. So that is
Right.
one factor that it appears as of now, that if Iran decides to go ahead, it will obviously face tremendous challenge, because it will go against the international maritime laws and international maritime rules and conventions. But if it at all wants to build something in terms of an infrastructure project, then perhaps other countries will have less to do with it, because it is Iran's sovereign decision to go ahead and build something. But having said that, it is very difficult to shut down the entire Strait of Hormuz unless, of course, it is mined by using sea mines by Iran. But overall, it appears that Iran can increase the risk factors, and Iran
No,
can
but if I may
can
interrupt
create
you.
hurdles.
Uh, Yeah, but Kallol, I wanted to interrupt you because Iran is already, I mean, despite making this formal provision of converting the Strait of Hormuz into a toll system, it is already running a de facto toll booth regime and a narrow stretch for which the few ships have already begun paying, and then they are allowed the safe passage. So, what about that? Is it not illegal? Is it not invalid? Can Iran be tried on on this count? Where do you see the challenge exactly? Because there's a small stretch for
Well,
which, yes,
well, Iran's argument is that Iran did not start this process. Iran is in the middle of a war, and the war was imposed on Iran, as we all know, on the 28th of February, 2026. So Iran's argument is that it did not start the conflict. It did not start this entire process of obstructions and all the bombings and etc. that are happening in the region. But Iran is being forced to do certain things in the region, like bombing the infrastructure and energy projects in the Arab Gulf countries. So it is part of the narrative that Iran has built to counter the war narrative of the US and Israel, that it is not something that Iran is doing as part of a peacetime activity. Iran is at war, and as a state that is at war, and to protect and defend its interests, Iran is being forced to undertake certain risky
certainly
initiatives. And
Iran is
this
forced.
particular
Kallol, Kallul, certainly Iran is forced to take a step like this, but then bringing in a legislation, does that not make it into a permanent feature which Iran is interested now in future? Because Iran also didn't realize that Hormuz could become such a big gold mine for them, and it's only during the war times they realized. And bringing in a legislation, which means that they want to make this feature into a permanent one.
Well, this is obviously part of the posturing, and they are delivering a message to the entire world that if they want to access the energy of the Gulf, then they will have to pass through Iran, which is literally the guardian of the Gulf. And they always make it sure that they refer to the Gulf as the Persian Gulf. So it is a part of posturing. But I'm sure that if this entire legislation is taken the whole distance, then it is a different ballgame, and this is a different chapter that will open up in the region. But having said that, the longer this war lingers, the clearer it becomes that Iran is in an advantageous position, and that Iran is in a position to draw the new rules of the West Asian and the Gulf region. Because
Right.
Iran is emerging, if Iran emerges, for example, if let's suppose Iran emerges as the ultimate victor in this war, of which it was not the initiator, of which it is not the original author, but if Iran emerges as the ultimate victor in this world, then Iran will be a very big strategic player in the extended neighborhood of India, where it will be in a position to lay down the rules of not just energy trade, but also of defense and the entire paraphernalia of international cooperation in the Gulf, and maybe all the way to South Asia, the Indo-Pacific, perhaps, because the might that Iran is projecting today is that it is in a position to fight, or rather defend, its interests almost a month after the war was started by the Israelis by bombing Tehran on 28th of February, when they killed the Ayatollah Khamenei and his close family and officials of the Iran government. So I think we are looking at a future scenario where this particular initiative will be tested. I'm not sure whether this particular legislation will see through in the way that Iranians are talking today. But this is something that we will have to examine in the context of the ultimate outcome of the war, and whether when Iran emerges, as I'm saying, understandably as the victor in this war, whether Iran would take it forward even in that peacetime.
Right. All right. Now let me come to Professor Pasha. Professor Pasha, how do you see this? The Iranian Parliament is, though it's yet to pass the legislation to impose the tolls, but in the past 2 weeks, what the data says is that about 26 vessels have transited through the strait, have followed a route which is pre-approved under the IRGC toll booth system. Now, what is this toll booth system? Is it something which is legal? And how can Iran validate this? Can it just say that these are war times, we are forced to do this? And then can it convert this into a permanent system, a toll system?
Yes, let me briefly give the geographic uh, description of this Strait of Hormuz. You see, from Iranian coast to the Omani coast, the total length of the strait is about 64 kilometers, and bulk of it is on the Omani coast, which is mountainous, and except shallow, small boats, oil tankers, and big ships cannot go through. So the real Strait of Hormuz is about 21 miles, and out of this 21 miles, the traditionally used area, which is suitable for big ships, containers, and oil tankers, and heavyweight ships, is on the Iranian side, which is within the 12-mile nautical territorial waters of a sovereign country, as Iran is claiming. So, for a long time, you see, since this narrow passage, which is passing through the bordering the Iranian coast, that has been widely used by most ships for in and out. And like the Suez Canal, Suez Canal was earlier one way. Ships from port side, from the Mediterranean, would come to the middle Bitter Lakes, and then they will be escorted by the Egyptian Navy. Now it is two-way. So ships can go up and down after paying the toll and escorted by the Egyptian Navy. And mind you, during the entire journey through the Suez Canal and the Egyptian territory, they cannot fly any other flag other than Egyptian. Any vessel, whether it is
Yes.
US Navy or commercial or whatever, they have to fly because it is Egyptian territory which they are using to transit. So what Iran now is doing is, since most of the ships use the Iranian side of the coast, which is most suitable for smooth passage without any accident. So for quite some time, they had been guiding the bigger ships. Smaller ships, they don't need. So the bigger ships were escorted because of the narrow length, because any accident, either on the left side or right side, either it will hit the coast or the incoming huge vessels. So they were traditionally guiding this with their own local GPS and Navy boat, Iranian Navy boat would signal, and they would leave the Gulf and pass through the Iranian Strait of Hormuz to the Arabian Sea and onward journey. So this has been the traditional factor, and Iran was not charging any toll for this. Now, for the first time, Iran is asserting, see, especially in the background of this unprovoked war on Iran and American rejection of the compensation and lack of guarantees which they are seeking that they will not attack again. So now, as Mustafa Khamenei said, if Iran is not paid compensation, we will find other ways to collect this and compensate the damages they have inflicted on us. So now the whole world is paying for the aggression by these two powers, Israel and America on Iran. Why they are doing is, you see, under international maritime law, you see, even in these territorial waters, every country has right of passage, innocent passage. And although they have to notify the coastal country, like in this case, Iran. So earlier they used to just routinely notify, and the Iran Navy would get the alert and they would escort to avoid accidents and blockage. So now they are claiming that it is a wartime situation, and any ship carrying anything, the contraband, they have the right to inspect so that it doesn't contribute to the enemy war efforts. So any weapons or any item deemed to be used in war, they have a right to check. And now they want to regularize and formalize this toll because you see, even though they have accepted the international law on this, but the parliament, Iranian Majlis, has not ratified. So there is a limbo, legal vacuum. And Iran is taking advantage of that. Like some of the ICC signatories, they have not ratified, so they are not bound by the International Criminal Court. Like that, Iran is using this to impose this toll tax, and they are preparing the legislation for approval by the Majlis, which in all circumstances, I think it will be approved, and that will be legislation will be sent to the International Maritime Association and United Nations and deposited there as a legal binding document. So Iran is well within its right to exercise this passage, and it has cited the example of Egypt because it passes through their Egyptian territory, and they say it is our sovereign right to monitor and charge like Panama or other countries they do. So this is in simple words. There are many legal rules, regulations, because Iran is setting aside all of those things, claiming it is in wartime situation and it cannot allow enemy ships, whether they are oil or non-oil, and their associates. So it is blacklisting all those countries whom it calls Israeli supporters or American supporters.
Ashraf, if I may ask you, can Strait of Hormuz be converted into a system like that of Suez Canal or a Panama Canal?
That's what I told you. They are converting that into a Suez Canal, Panama Canal system, whereby if you want to go from the Omani side, you take the risk and go. But if you are
Yes.
entering my 12-mile zone, you have to pay. Otherwise, you're
Okay.
free. We will just escort you, and if you want, we'll coordinate. But otherwise, if you want to enter our sovereign territorial waters, you have to pay. And that
Right.
is where the real shipping route is utilized by most of the big ships, because you see, it is not profitable for small ships to carry oil or gas from Qatar or other destinations to long distances. So, huge oil tankers, LPG, CNG tankers, they use to avoid the transit and premium insurance, etc. So paying $2 million, they'll pass it on to the customers, and the gas cylinder, which is 800 rupees, may become 1,000 rupees or less than that. So that's the only thing. But for the
What are
first
the
time, Iran is asserting the right to
right?
control its territorial waters. I think International Court of Justice also will uphold that, provided it is non-discriminative after the war.
No, but Professor Pasha, will it now be will it be an arrangement to which the countries who are importing oil or gas from the Strait of Hormuz, will it become mandatory for them now? Then, if this is the toll booth system which Iran is wanting the countries to adhere to, will it become mandatory for them to pay, or can they have some kind of a bilateral arrangement and then still get away?
Yeah, it is. It is like, you see, recharging the mobile. If you want to have 8 days, or 1 month, or 1 year, you can do that, or prepaid, postpaid, whatever it is. Like
Right,
if India uses this for 20 ships, we can have a bilateral agreement where the size of the ships, tonnage, and whatever it may be, that can be negotiated. That is what some countries are doing. It is not uniform rate for all ships. There are smaller ships also which pass through, and they are charging differentially all these ships, because the huge ships which carry millions of barrels of oil or tons of CNG, they are very risky to pass through, and any damage or accident could force the other ships to get stranded. So, which
right.
means Iran will be losing the revenue, and its territorial waters also might be polluted if it explodes or catches fire, so on. So, precaution and safety of the maritime traffic, also this is good, I think. But we have to pay a price for Iran because of the aggression, uh, without which Iran would not have touched and created this crisis.
Right, right. Okay, so let me get in the concluding comments from Kallol now that now the way Iran is tightening its grip on Hormuz, what does it look like? That the total picture as of now, tomorrow, the Iran-Israel war will complete 1 month, and the way Strait of Hormuz has emerged as the center of all the problems. Do you think that it's all about the control or the conflict? If I may ask you about the total picture.
Well, you see, there has always been this issue with Iran's nuclear program, right? The West wants to eliminate Iran's nuclear program. It also wants to now eliminate Iran's ballistic missile program. And finally, of course, get rid of Iran's military. Now, historically speaking, the region had four great military powers like Syria, Iraq, Iran, and of course, Turkey. Now, out of these four, the two militaries have gone. That is, the Iraqi military and the Syrian military have vanished. And in their places, now we have these militias and armed groups, etc., that have come. But that leaves us with the powerful military presence of Iran. And what this particular military has been very deeply aware for a very long time, and the rest of the world, perhaps especially the Western policymakers, fails to understand that Iran did not actually always require the thing called nuclear weapon. What Iran possesses, and when you use the term Strait of Hormuz and the control of Strait of Hormuz, what Iran is essentially doing is that it is using the energy or rather the energy market of the world and the energy infrastructure of the world as a weapon. So the Strait of Hormuz is, in effect, the physical form of that energy weapon that Iran has nurtured for a very, very long time. Now, today we are receiving the oil shock. But when we look at historically in 1973 and look at the oil shock of that time, that oil shock was delivered by the primarily the Arab, oil-rich kingdoms of the Gulf region. And at that time, Iran was not the leading power because Shah was still around, and Shah was a friend of the West. But today, what Iran is doing is that Iran has turned the entire Strait of Hormuz into a weapon, because it is the energy weapon that the Strait of Hormuz is unleashing, because it is controlling the flow of energy for the world. So I think, when we look at the issue that from the beginning of your program you have raised, that the Strait of Hormuz essentially signifies and sums up the energy weapon that Iran had been planning to use. So in this conflict, this idea that Iran could throw this surprise weapon against its enemies, that very notion was not anticipated.
Right.
A lot of people said that, well, Iran will not go to that extreme, Iran will not do this and do that. But Iran had actually promised that
Right.
if Israel and the United States repeated its attack from last year, then Iran would do something very dramatic. And Iran has kept that promise. And right now, what we are seeing, that the war has turned actually to the script of Iran. I mean, there is only one way of looking at it, that this war was produced by Benjamin Netanyahu. And the Benjamin Netanyahu government was at the driver's seat. But today, if you look at the comments coming from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, is that they are collapsing because there are not enough soldiers in the IDF to fight on behalf of Israel, because Israel is in the perennial mode to fight against its adversaries. But on the other hand, you look at the way that Iran has creatively used its weaponries. It's a mix of, and of course, it's suffering enormously. But while suffering, it is also creatively using its arsenal. It is using missiles, rockets, drones, and at the same time, it has weaponized the strait. So I think it is a very, very they call it asymmetrical warfare. But I would say this is a very creative warfare that Iran
Mm.
is throwing at
Yeah.
its opponents.
Right. All right. So we'll have to end it here. Thank you so much, Professor Pasha.
No,
Kallol, very much.
in a word, this crisis originated from the conflict and unjust, unprovoked aggression on Iran. In simple words. Otherwise, this Hormuz, nobody would have known
Exactly.
that it has become so important, a choke point for world economy.
Right. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Pasha. Kallol, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.